Welcome back to Therapy Business Matters with myself, Rob Bevan, and Jack Chew. Today we're discussing sales in healthcare. Is sales always a cringy word that we should be shying away from? And is it always associated with nefarious hucksters who are trying to make people buy things that they don't really want or even need? Or is it a vital part of running a healthcare service or a healthcare practice? Now, Jack, we both run private practices. You know, that is something that some people synonymize with bad practice and selling and pushy sales and unfortunately poor healthcare. So why does selling have this name associated with it of being cringy, being awkward, being bad?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I love the word huckster, by the way. That's absolutely brilliant. You caught me out with that. It made me chuckle. Yeah, I think that's the thing, is that this just generally people recognize that there's something unethical to exploiting the vulnerable that come to, and in healthcare, it's something that's so obvious. And I think that some of the biggest examples of malpractice and exploitation and abuse in various different contexts are kind of nested in healthcare or perceived from, when someone is at their most vulnerable and most needy, that they then look to a professional. And so therefore the last thing from their mind is sort of the used car salesman style tactics that can sometimes mean that, with a gift of a gab, maybe they could take advantage of someone's better nature, or take advantage of a moment in which they kind of hype to buy something that they maybe either don't want or don't need. And that's something that I think is it's something that is both an upside and a downside in our profession. It's got an upside in the fact that it kind of keeps us all sharp, and I think it's something that should be smart, that medical ethics and the act of doing no harm needs to apply across the board, and for business practices to not corrupt care. However, it also has this massive downside whereby sometimes that is overplayed. And there's various different things, both in terms of as individuals, sometimes we're too harsh on ourselves and each other in that, and not recognizing that sales is an important part of what we do, but then also that you then end up with this baggage whereby even on the politics of it, that people can then smear whole swathes of individuals or sections and sectors within the industry, as if to suggest there's something unethical inherently to the act of practicing. And that is certainly not good for the maturity of conversation, of which is why this podcast exists, of course. So it's a fascinating one, and one that I'm looking forward to sort of weighing in on some of those edge cases, I guess. I think that one of the things we could do is we could overgeneralize and not get into the detail. And I think that's where the detail and some of the examples that we could bring to bear, and we've spoken about off air, I think that's where the sort of magic happens with this, and how we can sort of take a bit of pressure off ourselves, but then similarly not go too far as to allow anything to go, and to pretend that there aren't hucksters and shysters and charlatans, or whatever words we need, for making sure we find a way to toe that line sensibly.
No, exactly. And I think that one of the reasons that it gets, unfortunately, a bad name is that when someone is in pain, and we're rare in that industry, that in the healthcare industry, we see people who are in pain, and I guess not more so in private practice, but definitely in private practice, you've probably been in the same. You've gone out to your waiting room and you've seen a patient, and they're lying on the floor, or they're kneeling on the floor, or they've been carried in by a friend, and, we probably have one a week, if not more, of people who are in the, severely bad way. And, people will do anything to get out of pain. So they will, the bad word, is this the right term? Fall for it. But, people, if they're sold a golden egg of something that's going to make them feel better tomorrow, they will buy it no matter what the cost, and especially if, when it comes to pain, money is often not really an option. People will do anything when it comes to getting back to play with their children, or to, drive to work or do their job. People will part with, as we've both have lots of examples of, I'm sure, huge sums of money to feel better tomorrow, which, often relies on single interventions and, unevidence-based practices, unfortunately. And that's part of why the reason these stories get spoken about. And it's always going to be a bias of unfortunately poor examples is always going to bias the conversation.
It's but that's the chicken and the egg thing, isn't it? It's like, do these examples that make all of our eyes water, whereby someone has been their expectations have been completely mismanaged based on a false premise, more often than not from a well-meaning clinician or set of clinicians that are then just inferring a really monocausal approach to a complex story. And therefore this person has spent often tens of thousands of pounds on various different interventions and people that have overpromised and underdelivered. Is that what then drives our sensitivity to sales, and therefore that somehow then gets to dictate the narrative? Or is it that we've got such a high sensitivity to it, and then those that are less bothered or less in touch with their own sort of sense of ethics, is that the chicken and egg, cart before horse? It's hard to know. I think on what you've just described then is that if we're, unless we have, and I'm surprised if it's out there because I've gone looking for it, but if we have the evidence to suggest that it's sort of a majority of case, right? So in private healthcare, of course, we're talking about therapy business here. Then if we were to understand that that's actually an ascendant and majority case, whereby either people as charlatans purposefully misleading and something like that, or those that are just someone that is behind the trends with regards to understanding mechanisms of interventions and the like. Oof, that made me jump. We've got a co-host as Rob's dog's just getting involved. There he is. So if that was in the majority, then you're in a different conversation. But I just don't think there's the evidence to suggest that. I think it's absolutely reasonable to recognise that these features exist, but it's not fair to smear a corner of an industry on it. And so instead, we need to start thinking about the fact that there's so much good practice and so much ethical practice that let's hope is in the majority, but it's at least a big portion of what's going on. People looking to care for people, and that is something that needs to be recognised as being also ascendant and important in this conversation. And if we start off at that point where we can recognise that yes, there's some bad, but there's also some good, and there's also some people that then go too far in recognising that they're so averse to sales because they see that as being somehow unethical inherently, that they then undertreat or under-evaluate and therefore don't well serve that person in pain, then that's an overcorrection that we need to try and account for as well. And so on balance, I just think that that's why, we need to chat about it at the very least.
And I think that's one of the reasons why it makes it, a sticky or an icky topic, isn't it? Because people are so desperate to not be associated with that poor model. And, especially if people have come from a previous model like that, I've had patients that have come in and they've said, oh, yeah, I just had a bit of an achy back and the guy wanted me to, have 1,800 quid's worth of treatment or whatever it was. And then, he wanted to see me 3 times a week for 8 weeks, whatever it may be, whatever the model might be. At that time, it wasn't appropriate, clearly. And then I've done it myself. I've been so desperate not to be associated with that. I've under-delivered or I've undersold. And I've said, what this person actually needs. And I've actually gone more to we'll just see how it goes, which, I'm under-servicing that patient because I'm so desperate to move away from that, existing model or that poor model.
Yeah, there's definitely that overcompensation, and I think that's something I think we can all get sucked into, especially in cases of which their story is littered with people that have often inadvertently taken advantage. I think one of the things to be said, although we're not going to be able to get stuck into it in this podcast, is that the reason that, and me and you, most of the chats that we've had over the years, especially as we've got to know each other, I say over the years, it's like we've been long friends. It's been a fairly intense year of us getting to know each other, really. To do all of this together. But we often talk about sort of clinical issues and have sort of sized each other up over clinical reasoning, is because that's where it really matters, is that are you in a position where you're inferring that you can help someone through something with mechanisms of effect that are dubious, without an eye on the evidence base or understanding how the evidence might inform your practice in such a way that then when people have then said, look, your back's only aching, I know your back's aching a bit now, but they genuinely feel that you need that 1,800 quid's worth of treatment, as you described it, because you need to correct for these biomechanical faults that we've come to unearth. This is what your x-ray shows. These are the inevitabilities of inaction. They've managed to, what we would argue, delude themselves over that. But that is something that is why you and I are often at pains to talk about clinical examples. It's like the clinical stuff, the evidence-informed stuff, that what is the best way to treat said knee, shoulder, back. Like that is central to the reasoning that is prior to the sales, right? That's why we want to talk about this, but also why you don't start with that. And that's the thing that people often get frustrated if they're always wearing this business hat, right? The world littered with business coaches and stuff like that, especially right now. And I understand why. I've sort of spoken about it on my Tune It Over show about the fact that there's this esteem issue going on at various different parts of the industry. Is that if they're thinking in that business sense all the time, they're irritated when someone like us then speak about the fact that, well, clinical first, right? Or reasoning first, or because they sort of like, well, no, they're so used to the lack of ethics on sales.
And as you said, if your clinical reasoning dictates your sales. So if you fully believe that you're trying to, I can't think of an example, realign the curve in someone's spine, and and that takes 3 months to 6 months to a year to correct itself, then that's going to underpin your sales, because there's no, it's that or this. There's, it's a false dichotomy. It's not like, to have this, it takes 6 months, full stop. So that's going to take X amount of treatment. So that's always going to underpin your sales tactics. Whereas if you are on the complete other end of the spectrum, when you think everybody's completely kind of 100% self-manage all of their issues, then that's going to dictate your business and your sales, which is, okay, we'll do once, we'll give them some exercises, maybe some soft tissue, whatever your practice is, and then we'll send them on their way to kind of self-manage and hope they have enough self-efficacy to manage that. So those are kind of the terms of the spectrum, and it's dictated, your sales package or your treatment package will be dictated by your beliefs, I guess.
Well, that's the thing with both, in that weirdly is contentious, like both on a patient level and on a therapist level. It is, some people just don't agree with what we're saying there, that beliefs do influence behaviors, and that's not always, that they're not always sort of really dynamically attached, but they often do influence it. It's like, why wouldn't they? And that's the sort of thing whereby if a patient feels that their spine is so vulnerable, it's almost like glass, that's going to influence their behaviors, their movements, etc., their patterns, the way in which they interact with the world. But then similarly, if a therapist also then believes that, and the indications as to what care they might deliver or the behavior around that person's body and the way that they then suggest what treatment they need, that's why clinical education is something that ends up being first, second, and third on our list. But then once you've kind of got that in line, it is unethical for you to then compromise the care delivery and the explanation and the expectations that you then relate to the patient and the prognosis. All of those things that to stop that because of your squeamishness over sales is ridiculous, especially because we kind of know the engagement with rehabilitation that we've talked about on this show and beyond over time is so key to their behavior change that we know has been sort of really important to their recovery or to their management of this problem ongoing, is that never think about it in sales or of money changing hands, right? But you're needing to sell that idea. You need to get them to comply and sell that concept and compliance. Therefore, of course we're selling, regardless of context, regardless of whether you're in the public, private, charity sector, I don't care. You're needing to sell that idea. You're selling yourself to them. There are many different things outside of money that you're selling, and therefore the concepts we're talking about is really important.
We sell trust at the end of the day, and we sell an experience, and we sell everything from, and when that, as you said, whether you're in private practice or the NHS, when you walk out to see a patient and you introduce yourself and you say, hi, I'm going to be looking after you today. If you're selling yourself and you're selling your trust or that patient's trust, that they have to believe in what you say. And that goes both ways, whether you're trying to, sell them that they're not going to be running for the next 3 months because they've got an acute hamstring tear or whatever it may be. They have to believe you. And if you're shy and you are looking down at the floor and you haven't introduced yourself properly and you're not animated and, enthusiastic when you're speaking to a patient, as one example, if it's appropriate, there are, that patient's not going to believe you. And then you're selling yourself, and then you might be underselling yourself, which is not going to garner that trust and that rapport, and ultimately may do that patient, not always, but may do that patient a disservice. If they don't believe you and they think, oh, this isn't going to take 3 months, what's he talking about? It's not that bad. And then, within 6 weeks, they, go for a sprint session on the beach and then re-injure themselves. You've done that patient a disservice because you aren't aware of how you should have sold that experience to them. And that's completely aside from money. That money's got nothing to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why if you imagine that a thorough examination and discussion around the the variables at play with that patient, and then the negotiation of what is how are they going to be able to comply with a treatment plan that you're pitching, and it is a pitch.
Yeah.
Then it all falls down on that, and this temptations in. I think that's the thing that I want to make sure I admit, and this is where some people might feel like this is just a projection, because it's an admission from me that I think is representative of others I've spoken to and witnessed. But generally speaking, I think that when you sat there, there is temptation to over reassure, and therefore to infer, please worry less about this, and actually, given the right circumstances, with or without me, this is going to do very well. And sometimes that's an appropriate thing to say, by the way. But if you go too far that way, you're not offering the support that they actually are requiring and needing. But then there's also this, I think, a devil on my shoulder sometimes, whereby you can so understand a temptation to get more involved and to infer that they need you more than they do, and that some people, in some circumstances, might well have pound signs as being one of the things that is motivating that behavior, that temptation to think, well, maybe this person would be better off if they saw me every day. This conversation's gone well, this assessment's gone well, this treatment's gone well. Therefore, if we replicate that at a frequency that might seem unusual, then actually that, you can convince yourself of that. And I admit those sensations bubbling up in me and respect the fact that I don't succumb to them, but equally to pretend that they're not there, I think is a fallacy.
Yeah. So what would dictate you changing what you felt was right for a patient? So if you have a patient that you feel needs X, but they are in the negotiation stage, and they, without putting words in your mouth, depending on what type of patient would they have to be that would make you change your mind about what you felt was necessary? Would there be any patient traits or any particular injuries, or would it be based on pain levels, finance? What would change anything for you?
Yeah, two key variables on that would be how much on my assessment of them have I, and you're only ever going off best guess, as well as you can use some fairly clunky measures for this, but you're kind of assessing as to, is there something that my treatment could compromise their self-efficacy or facilitate their self-efficacy for them to actually have because their sense of self, their sense of robustness is really important to me as a sort of really quite intangible outcome. And so that would be one of the things that sort of dictated the frequency of care that I wouldn't dictate, but it would definitely be where that might influence my pitch. So you might assess someone and recognize that this is someone that definitely I feel would benefit from us continuing this care and seeing them weekly. However, in a situation whereby, and obviously, and they can, and you can give them that opportunity to, but with regards to when you realize that actually one of the things that's in your story is that the frequency only ever increases, and that there's no mechanism of exposure to you having to make any of your own decisions, and that there's you look at someone's previous episode of care, whether they're under our care or under someone else's care, and you hear of that story and you think that there was never a moment in which you really had to then act on it. You had to self-direct your own dosage. You needed to sort of decatastrophize that yourself. And so therefore that need and exposure of literally time passing between appointments might be a key intervention that I've evaluated. So that's one thing. The second one is whether they are in a situation where they can adjust their lifestyle to be most compatible with the treatment I'm pitching. So, for example, their employment status and their own admission of their financial circumstance, not because of payment to us, but I mean the fact that they are a mechanic or a plasterer needing to work overhead at a frequency of which is continually pissing off their subacromial pain. And we kind of know that they need at least a relative rest from some of those really aggravating things that seems to be really irritating, bursa cum tendon cum whatever it might be, right? And those are the sorts of things whereby a discussion around, is there a time frame of which we can try and take you off that, even though I know it's massively disruptive to your lifestyle? And if not, is there a frequency in which we might intervene? Or even sometimes a dosage of medication or dosage of pain relief of any manual flavor or whatever it might be, that would then mean that you're just admitting that there's no circumstance in the world, barring me literally fracturing this arm, which is often a tactic I use, by the way, is saying, what if it was in a cast tomorrow? You fall over and it's in a cast tomorrow. You're literally not doing it then. oh yeah, that's different. Why is it different? Can you not buy me a few weeks like you would do
I like
in
that.
cast I sometimes use? But so it's me to force the issue on some relative rest. And again, I'm selling that idea, aren't I? So let's not pretend that that's not sales. But I'm kind of getting at the fact that when you would change the conversation to this is the ideal way in which you will interact with the world, I think, for the next few weeks or months or whatever, that would optimize your recovery. And if you're admitting to me for whatever reason that you can't, there's no way you could do that, then that's where we might change the intervention or change the plan to best suit your needs. I mean, what examples do you have where you've felt that you need to alter what might be optimal generically because you're tailoring it to a consumer's need?
Mine will probably be more unique to me as a chiropractor than you may see as a physio. Probably the people who will come in to see me, and they may have been heavily reliant on something going back into place or popping out of place. And I've had patients that I could think of one who I saw just after Christmas who had seen a chiropractor, might have been, I think, in a different country she started and then came to this place, our country. And she had been seeing a chiropractor once a week, give or take, for 20, 30 years, just standard. It was just, she was on money aside, it was actually a fairly cheap plan, but that's besides the point. But she was heavily reliant on, any niggle, pop in, see the chiropractor, and she'd walk in and it would be 3 minutes, she'd be out the door. And in that case, for a patient then to come in and see me, and I say, yeah, we're going to do some squats and we're going to do some lunges and I'm going to see you in 6 weeks, is not for me an appropriate management, because she's going to walk out of there and go, not really happy about that. What if I need to see him next week? He doesn't want to see me next week. What happens if I have pain? She's going to then go somewhere else who may not have the same ethical or the same treatment basis that I have. And then she might fall back into that cycle. So I would say that for me would then do that patient a disservice. So I would probably in that case see that patient more frequently in order to garner that rapport and garner that trust in me, that then I can then slowly unpack those beliefs. And then I can, rather than laying it all out on day one, meet her in the middle and then slowly kind of step back. And then within 6 weeks, I can know that, and this is a lady, she's a runner. And now I see her son, and her son was saying, she's so reliant on this chiropractor. You need to change her mind. You need to, any niggle that she runs and sees someone. And I saw her son, and she's like, she's doing 50 squats every morning, and before she plays with the grandchildren, all that stuff. And for me, that's an amazing outcome measure, that she's, not only is she feeling better, that's because she wasn't actually in a lot of pain anyway. She just had this belief that she needed to, but it was her self-efficacy has improved. And that's the outcome measure. So that's where I change. Whereas when I see a patient who, say, for example, they are a triathlete and they are very good at doing rehab. Every morning they wake up and they do 15 minutes of yoga, and then they do 15 minutes of rehab, and then they do their kind of training on the side of that. That's the patient when, they've got that, I've got that trust. We're on the same page from day one, and I can trust them to go away and do some stuff for a couple of weeks and then come back and see me. So my treatment beliefs are the same when it comes to both of those patients, but my pitch or my package of care, if you can use that term, is different for those two different patients.
Yeah, the duration of time of which you've been able to adjust the expectation on that care, especially when there's been a story where you're needing to uncouple some unhelpful beliefs. Yeah. And if that is beyond, more often than not, beyond a session, it's like it's too abrupt if you were to try to overhaul that lifetime's worth of perception, bodily perception, in one session. Therefore, you've got to go steady on that. And sometimes that frequency is something that, the rationale for why you're seeing someone frequently is so key. It's rather than the actual numbers. It's where the qualitative certainly overrides the quantitative. What is it that you're doing that for? Why might you follow up with someone within days? Is often just to make sure that your messages land, or that there's a comprehension there that doesn't then lead to a dispute that only grows. Is different to saying, see you tomorrow because we need to keep realigning you. It's just a different phenomenon. But also, I think what's interesting, your triathlete you've just described, then a decent stereotype there in many ways for us just to play on, is that there's a circumstance whereby they've just missed a curb and they've then jarred their knee back, right? They've flared up a fat pad. That's a new episode of fat pad pain or something like that, right? And they come in, they assess for it, and this is someone you've seen before. You kind of comprehend their self-efficacy. They've self-managed and recovered well prior for various different, say, tendinopathies or stress reactions or whatever that they've had. But this person that you've seen that then you do one of my favorites, I'm using the fat pad as an example because it's like taping techniques for the fat pad is just like, it's my go-to. And so say you were to do that and to offload that and give some relief to it, and that, arguably you could try to get them to self-apply that, but say they can't do so quite as effectively. If you were to see that person a couple of times a week as a means of administering that whilst they were to start to develop their own recovery, and this is someone that then also just didn't want to take whatever drugs they could get, actually the tape's far more effective than any drugs for just taking the edge off this for a bit of time whilst they're needing to still walk into work or whatever, then you're in a situation where it would be so strange if that then created some sort of passive dependency in this person from what you've come to understand them of, even if you've never seen them before, but based on their behaviors and your clinical instinct as to the likelihood of them being in a situation where you're never going to be able to stop strapping their knee. It just seems so bizarre that they would become that person. And that's a je ne sais quoi of clinical judgment, that this, what on earth is unethical about that if it's to facilitate sensible rehabilitation that then also creates a robust, self-managing, very athletic person who's got a decent bodily perception. You've not, and obviously the suggestion as to what that tape is doing is obviously key to that. Is that, if you're saying that tape is doing more than it is, that's another issue. But when you're not doing and you're explaining it sensibly and it is just a pain-relieving modality in the brief term, why not? It's like that's where it seems silly, and that why is that not sales, right? Why is that not?
I guess that comes down to as well in terms of the financial model. I mean, if they're reliant on that, I mean, are you, because we have similar situations to that. And I often say to patients, if, as long as, aside from however you explain the tape works, and if you are selling them all sorts of nonsense about it, then that's a different question, probably not up for discussion here. But in the example that you used is a prime one, which can make a big difference quite quickly. We do that, but I will often say, that's fine. If this makes a big difference, I'm happy to retape it if you need to, but I won't charge them for that. I will say just pop in between in between another treatment session or at the end of the day, and I'll just pop a bit of tape on. And that's my model. And I'm sure people probably listen to this thinking you're an idiot. You could charge them for your time, but that for me then changes the meaningfulness of that intervention. And if it's an intervention which, we know is a short-term intervention to allow them to function, then I won't charge it. Come in. It takes 3 minutes to pop some tape on, 5 minutes to that. You might have a little chat and check everything's going okay as well. Then that's, to me, is similar to just giving someone a ring after work, giving them a phone call. I don't charge them for that for that time. So I think it depends on the meaningfulness of that intervention, really.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's a good example whereby you can really comprehend that being a sometimes even 90-second between patient thing. I suppose what's different is that sometimes that might be for the distance of which they're traveling, the circumstances of which the likelihood of them saying, especially, the intensity of some triathletes, and I'm not calling them on this, but it's just that while I'm here, do you mind if we just have a little look over my Strava? Now I mention it, this is also something. And that depends on their belief. Booking.
I think it depends on their belief as well. And I think that's when you have to fall in, is careful of their belief on that intervention, because I'm sure you've had patients who you've explained tape or treatment or whatever it might be to, but they don't listen, or say don't listen, they haven't fully understood it, probably through our fault rather than theirs, or they're just so reliant on tape, for an example, that they come in and say, oh yeah, that tape really did kind of help drain that fluid off my knee, or it did help activate my quad so I felt stronger when I was running. That's when it is careful, and that's when you have got to be careful about that, about, oh yeah, just pop back in, I'll retape it, because then that's when you need to then have a bigger conversation, I think, about understanding what it does.
Yeah. Well, that's the difference, because there's an upper limit to what can be done in those like sneak in between appointment type interventions. Yes, but then there's also, it does depend as to how much did the education that accompanied it land, and if it's something that needs to be reiterated even more than just slightly, and you don't always know. You're like, right, it's just sneak you in, and then whilst you're doing it, they go, what's this doing again? And if that what's it doing again comes, ends up being a back and forth, it probably has been a bit clumsy to try and sneak them in, because fundamentally it needs to be a bit more that lands on this. And that if you'd kick yourself if they run past you in the street in 8 weeks' time, recovered, but with a bit of tape on that they've self-administered, you know full well that they've thought that is something more biomechanically corrective or more necessary to them than you'd think. You'd kick yourself because you'd not booked that in for a more thorough discussion alongside other things. So it is so context specific, and that's what's interesting is that, me and you are so guilty of this. Is we're on a Therapy Business Matters podcast, right? But we can't help but say that the clinical stuff should be informing this, and that should be the way in which you're managing those expectations. Now, one of the examples that we talked about is how do you go about sort of I called it a pitch, I think, early on this show, but I often do, is that do a thorough subjective and objective assessment and come to a plan. You start to then discuss, when I'm having a back and forth with them about this is what I would propose as the treatment plan, and explaining the analysis as part of that. What are your tactics as to then selling that package, and also selling the frequency, and sometimes even will then, no doubt, it will visit the cost of that as well.
Yeah, so in the chiro world, this is always called the reporter findings. That's, I don't know whether you use that phrase or not, but that's the reporter findings when you sit down with a patient and you say, yeah, so this is X, Y, and Z. This is what's going on. So I'll always start with the problem. So this is what's going on, and then I will then refer to usual natural timeframes for recovery, in terms of, realistically, how long is this going to take? Whether that's an ankle sprain, for example, this, we know within 6 weeks, and you're going to be back to, in the vast majority of cases, be back running, sprinting, jogging, jumping, whatever it is, if you follow these protocols. And that might be rehab, that might be some lifestyle, whatever it might be, if you follow these. And then I think, as we alluded to off air, I do very similar to what you do, which is I will give you those parameters for this is what will help and this is what will make it worse. If you go out tomorrow and go and compete in that triathlon, it might make it worse. It might not, but it might make it worse. And then that might set you back a bit further than if you were fully recovered. If you then re-injured it again, that's going to set you back another 6 weeks from where we are now. That's kind of the time frame I will. I'll try and be overconfident with patients, when they are looking for hard and fast answers. A lot of the time they're not looking for an underconfidence. I'm not really sure about this. I think if you generally don't know, or we don't know, then that's fine to say, but they are looking for answers. If they're saying, are you the person to help me? Saying, well, actually, yes, I am, but so there's lots of other people. That's not really going to help that patient. That's not going to build that trust or that confidence. Whereas if you're saying, yes, I am the best person right now to help you, and if I'm not, I will direct you to the person who you need to see, then that is a completely different turn of phrase, which turns around the intervention for you. So it's giving them confidence. And then also I'll tell them what happens if they did nothing. What would happen if you completely left this and went home tomorrow? And then that's different for every single condition, which patients see us. And then I'll give them an estimated number of treatments. I'll give them a frequency, and then go from there, really. And then in my practice, I'll always do some form of intervention on that first session, whatever that may be, whether that's exercises. I'm not a fan of go home and think about it, and then we'll come back in and do our first session next week. Rarely in some cases that's appropriate, but they're few and far between, I think, in a lot of cases, outside of really, really acute traumatic injuries, or something you've got to refer on for some imaging, or refer on to a different practitioner. That's a different question. But I'll always do some form of intervention of some kind in that first session as well. So those are kind of the tactics that I will use. I'm a big hater of fear-mongering type tactics, which is I'm the only person that can ever help you. You're going to die if you don't have this intervention. You're going to have spinal arthritis. All those phrases, which you hate. And
Thank God you're here. Thank God you're here, just in time.
And I anything which, it says promoting that reliance, I guess, which we said before, is not for me. That's not my cup of tea, really. So and I'm sure it's not yours either.
No, on that conviction piece, it's such an interesting reflection, because that's something that I think it's one of the reasons why I think sales is so uncomfortable for so many people, is because we're in such a funny spot with MSK that there is so much uncertainty, and we're then handling that uncertainty. And that when you're then, what I said was pitching, I prefer report of findings. I don't think it's something that we've used, but why not? And I think that then there are people that would be too cavalier and too convinced of their own patter there, and sort of therefore be quite rigid and not manage expectations well, because they are just, yes, it's something that this sort of a potent style of intervention to then say, this is gonna work. that, then be the facts of the matter. That is a bit of an overpromise on something that is I know what you're not suggesting. But then similarly, when people that are too vague and too dithery and say, well, this maybe is probably worth us trying, sort of, kind of, and it's worth a try. You're right, it's not fair. But also, I think what I'd encourage people to do, and again, forgive me for being a bit clinical about it again, is the best way to feel comfortable in those circumstances is to be comfortable in those circumstances. And by that is, when you're saying, I think I'm the best person to help you with this right now, you've got to believe it, assess them thoroughly, listen to them carefully, and be the person in the world in that moment in time. They're sat in front of you, so the odds are in your favor, is that what you're about to suggest to them, be comfortable that you are, even if you're not convinced that this is going to work or anything like that, you're definitely in a situation where the odds are in your favor to be the right person for them. And so don't allow for sort of a monkey on your back or a chip on your shoulder to sort of affect you too much on something like that. I think it's something that really you're better off erring on the side of confident there, because it's both for sales tactics, but also I think odds are that that's actually accurate. You are, you are likely to be the best person to help them with it. And I think that that's something that does bother people, is that they think that because there's so many grey areas and there's so much vagueness that comes from the evidence as it's informing our practice, and the lack of conviction we now have over the mechanisms of effect compared to yesteryear, means that needs to be transferred into every conversation with the patients. So that every question that they say, we have to say, I don't know, about 3 or 4 times as a caveat to proceed what we're actually going to suggest. And it's something that style of dithering, or sometimes over academic musing, is certainly not a smart move, not just for sales, but also for instilling that confidence.
Yeah, and patients don't care about the realistically about the Cook and Purden model of progressive tendinopathy. They don't care about the difference between tendinitis and tendinopathy. Some people do, of course they do, and that's appropriate to go into that conversation when it is. But the majority of people, all they want to know is, are you the person to help me? How long is it going to take to get better? What can't I do? And those are the kind of the most important things. And I like to think of when a patient leaves my clinic, and this is what I say to my staff and the people we have working with me, is when that patient walks out, those are the things that they should know. Are you the person that's going to help them? What are you going to do? How long is it going to take? And what factors are going to influence that? Whether that's my lifestyle, whether it's my work habits, whether it's my exercise habits. That's it. They're not going to get home and talk to their partner about substance P. It's not something which they're going to go down that line. And you don't need to. If I'm sure we've all had patients. I had a molecular biologist who was fascinated in the various stages of things like that, which she knew far more about it than I did. But and we're interested to have that conversation. But those are the 1 in 100 patients, realistically.
If you've had the sense, you've found that out.
Yeah, exactly. You know that.
You're like the most important things that what you've got to find out their expectations. It's the most important. I might have said it. Forgive me if I've said this on this very podcast before, but certainly, like, the 2 most important questions in my subjective towards the end of it, usually. But I'm fairly versatile with regards to the order of which I do things when I'm doing said interview. But just out of interest, what do you think's going on?
Yeah.
And finding a way to force that answer. So more often than not, people will, and it sounds harsh to say force, but I mean, like, people will just, I haven't a clue, that's why I'm here. And so I then follow up quite hard on that and say, let's just, like, best guess. Everyone's got a best guess. I promise I'm not going to hold you to it. Don't worry. I want to unearth what they think is going on in their deepest recesses of their mind if they have to engage with it. Yeah. And then the second thing that follows on from that, which I've had to make sure I've got an answer for, is, and what do you therefore think is your best guess as to what it needs to get better? To try to understand as to, and I often call it, and this is probably another podcast if you fancied it, is that I call it the guy in the other room. Like, who's the person you're typically competing with here? Because if you elicit that information and they say, well, I think I moved badly, and that's what's doing it, is I'm putting undue stress through this and it's damaging X.
That's my posture.
And then you say, what is it? Therefore, what is it do you think that you need to get better? And you say, well, that's why I'm on the fence about how much you could help, because I think I need to go and see a podiatrist, because essentially it's all the footfall thing. Yeah. I know that the guy in the other room, the person I'm competing against for logic, depending. By the way, I'm about to assess this person, because they might be right, like on something like that. but there might be someone better suited to. But you want to know that, you want to evaluate that, you want to be able to explain to them. And often then, as part of my pitch reporting the findings, is that I'm then explaining that those features are. This is where I think your instincts were fairly good. But actually, the proposition of what would correct for that or improve that problem, actually, I think for these reasons, I disagree, or whatever it might be. Sometimes you just say, fair play, you were right on both counts, and let's get on with it. But, you're better off knowing.
Yeah.
And I think that process of finding that out and having that extra bit of depth to the social features of your subjective assessment is really important. And it's really important for you to best clinically care for them, because you understand their individual functional needs and their expectations, their goals, the ways in which sometimes they think. It's the only way sometimes you can elicit in some people a bit of overzealous paranoia about just how vulnerable they are, and a catastrophizing recess that they might have. But then also on the other side, you've got sometimes asking those questions, you realize that they're being probably a bit too cavalier. They don't think that matters so much. They're not likely to engage with what it means for this diagnosis, and therefore what they propose is going to get better. They don't care. Sometimes means that they're likely to be quite passive. They're not going to engage necessarily in the process as much. You'd rather know about that. And therefore, to not bring that forward means you're going to be a poor clinician, but also you're going to it's going to really corrupt your sales ability. And then you're not going to be able to understand it.
And then on the back of that, there's two other questions which help that is have you ever seen a chirophysio osteo before? And what's your understanding of what I'm going to do? Because if straight away, if they're on you're probably just going to pop my pelvis back in, it's going to feel better, then that's a very different conversation compared to if I've never seen anyone like this before. Are you going to do a bit of massage? You're going to, I have no idea basically. And then the other on the back of the goals type question is I don't like the term goals really for patients, because I feel that often, obviously patient dependent, but many of them don't really understand that. Whereas if you say, I like to phrase it as, what's the pain stopping you, or this problem stopping you from doing right now, and what do you want to get back to? That changes that perception slightly. Well, actually, I'd really quite like to go and I can think of a patient straight away who said, I really want to do Everest Base Camp, and he was early 60s at the time. He was like, I really want to go and climb Everest Base Camp, and that was his goal. Whereas it wasn't stopping him. That was his goal. But if I was kind of said, yeah, probably he would have come up with, if I said, what's your goal? But I find it often it's a difficult, a harder conversation to get out of people.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that sometimes surprises when I've talked a bit about sales and marketing and things within my team, or even sometimes in workshops, although, typically, as we've said on this podcast before, me and you, we're enacting this stuff, but typically not in the business of educating and teaching it really. It's something that we're kind of keeping his noses clean on, is that people are surprised that one of the key questions that I'm bothered about with regards to sales is saying to patients, especially this is towards when we've done a very full evaluation, I'm sort of saying to them, out of interest, if you had to pick one of these two, is this something that is an annoyance or a limitation? Because often it's between. But I'm not saying that if they suggest that this problem is an annoyance, that therefore that's not worth managing and treating. If they get a bit of annoying knee pain 20 miles into a marathon, doesn't mean that they therefore aren't worthy of our care. But it's a massive difference in terms of that underlying what might be motivating these behaviors. Is part of my treatment plan more onerous than is worthwhile for the gains that they're going to get? Because it's a bit annoying. If it's a bit annoying, yet what you've actually suggested is quite disruptive to their lifestyle. That is a factor that's going to affect the likelihood of them and what frequency they might be craving. Yeah. And it can go either way. And so sometimes you want to invite those what feel like, typically that's me sort of trying to understand the sensitivity and irritability of a problem. It sounds like a very clinical question, but it should influence your sales, and it should influence the way in which you do it. And I think when it comes to the brass tacks on the money, is that you've got to, for me, be in a situation where you don't try to read the minds and be so bold as to understand that person's individual finances. That's not fair. It's not right. It's judgmental, and it's clumsy. But you're just in a situation instead to sort of say, and this is my favourite line, is just say that this is what I think is going on. This is what I suggest, and also, how involved do you want us in this case? these are your options, and this is the trajectory, and these are the, if you do the right things, this is how I feel it's going to go. How involved do you want us? By the way, I've given them parameters around that then, as to sort of suggested what that should look like. But that it's up to them to bring the variable of price in for me. I don't know if you do anything different to that.
No, yeah. So I'm a big fan of giving patients options and giving them the A, B, or C, or A or B type approach, in terms of, I don't phrase it quite like that, but these are the options. And I heard it from someone, I can't for the life remember who it was, but she said, imagine if you went to a dentist and you kind of said, yeah, I've got this tooth. And he said, yeah, this is what you need. You need to have a big gold tooth right in front of your top teeth. This is going to cost you 500 quid. And then that broke in 2 years' time, and you went to see a different dentist. And they said, oh, yeah, you could have a gold one. Or if you paid 1,500 quid, you could have a normal tooth-coloured one. And the guy, why wouldn't they give me that option? And, because he prejudged me about my finances and assumed that I wouldn't be able to afford that. How would that make you feel? So if you give people the options, as they said, as long as they are bound within your own ethics and within your own treatment parameters, then you give them the option and let them make that decision. As long as they're both good decisions, it shouldn't really make a difference for you for whether they choose A, B, or C. As long as they're good decisions, then that's fine. But let them make that. Let them make that choice. And you can always say that this is the preferred option, but it's up for them to decide which one's best, which one's going to be most suited to their goals, habits, lifestyles, everything really.
Absolutely. I think that this is what's sometimes my approach is seen as being too vague for some people's taste and then too particular for others. But it's because it's tethered to my reading of the evidence, as well as the way in which we are in MSK practice, as well as the ethics, the philosophy, the style of care that we're looking to deliver as a company, as a brand, as a person. And I think that that's something that we all need to sort of get a grip of as well, is that is where there is individual difference, and that there isn't a right or wrong on. And what I mean by that is that when there's so many MSK conditions, especially ones of which present to us, especially because we are famously rehab-centric practice, as well as one that sees an awful lot of cross-referrals, right? So we see one of our little slogans being the physios that physios trust. And that's something, that ability to recognize that is a differential of the clientele that might see. But what I therefore have is a read of MSK conditions is that sometimes I'm making that proposal, and I'm sort of saying that there is, that given the right circumstances and the right changes that you might make, then this is a positive trajectory. That if you don't underdo it for whatever reason, or overdo it for whatever reason, if you get the right dosage of functional scaling of your abilities, then you're likely to do well. Then because of that, which is a vague statement so far, but that is my very genuine read of many cases that come in. Not everyone, absolutely, but many cases that come in. And so therefore, when I then say, and so then comes, how involved would you like us in this case? You think that I'm speaking to someone that might have traveled 2.5 hours to get to us, especially in a pandemic when they're not meant to, and they've been stopped at the Welsh border, been told off by some policeman, right? So this is the weird world in which we currently live in at the moment with the pandemic. But it's like that is really relevant, isn't it? Is that what frequency would you like us involved in terms of how often might you come in? How often might we do formal virtual consultation? And so you might have someone that's 5 minutes down the road who, unbeknownst to me, he's a multi-millionaire that then he's just like, in a situation where if he'd prefer to come in every day, then it's up to them to bring some of those variables forward. But you can sort of say that this is the sort of thing in which it seems initially it's smart for us to see you fairly frequently, because you need to get you into good habits and change things. And from what I can see from this session, it seems to have been quite useful for you to be exposed to sometimes it's even just these ideas, or, this
conversation.
Or sometimes this tendon of yours needs loading more than the weights you've got at home, and I've not got these at home, right? It seems smart for us to need to load your soleus in our Smith machine. It's like these are relevant variables, especially when the gyms are closed. It's like So there's so many factors that are so individually specific that I'm not suggesting I then leave it. And it's my version of see how it goes. I'm just saying that there are diminishing returns on someone perceiving that actually they're going to accelerate the recovery by seeing us more frequently. And I just think that is bullshit. And I think that is what irritates me, is this notion that the more frequent, therefore, the more you're going to facilitate someone's recovery. In some circumstances, yes, but only as a means of developing self-efficacy, not because the interventions of which you're doing is facilitating that recovery. It's subtly different, but important to me. And that's my prerogative. That's my choice.
Yeah.
But people would paint with such a broad brush and suggest that if anything, that the numbers are really relevant there. Like it's the rationale matters less than the actual frequency. You've seen someone too many times in any given month or quarter, then that's telling. Similarly, there's other side whereby that will suggest that those numbers are inherently too low, and you're not offering a thorough enough service. And both of those are not respecting the individual difference of both clinicians as well as patients, and that's why we try not to paint with too broad a brush.
I couldn't agree more. There's situations for every single patient that vary hugely, and you have to take those into account when, it's very easy to sit back on our high horses and judge X, Y, and Z when, it's not always going to be the case, and it's, so I think that's a really good note, actually.
Could you talk us through an unethical upsell and an unethical downsell? Like, what can you? Because those are some things that you brought forward, and I thought was really interesting points. Because sometimes people can comprehend one, but then actually underpitching something is.
Yeah, and I think that's the one which doesn't get spoken about as much. It doesn't get pasted on social media quite as much with the same brush that oversell does. So start with that. So my example will be something which we know is not going to be better in 3 weeks' time. Whatever that may be, a really acute ankle sprain, a hamstring tear, a really acute lumbar radicular pain, whatever it might be. If you know that and you really know, according to all of the research, that this patient is not going to be back on the rugby pitch, next weekend, and they are really keen to get back on the rugby pitch, whatever it takes. And if you're saying, actually, we'll see what we can, and you're saying, okay, we'll do some treatment today, we'll load it, we'll strap it, whatever it might be, you'll probably be good for next week, and we'll see how it goes. That to me is an undersell. So that is, you're doing that patient a disservice. And you know that if they're going to go sprinting around on a rugby pitch, they're likely to irritate it more. They're likely to, damage is the bad word, but piss it off more, do more damage, do more harm potentially to that injury. And that's then only going to set them back further. And that is an undersell for that patient, and is not good clinical care or business sense really for that. Whereas the oversell is much easier. That is forcing reliance on you as a practitioner. It's fear-mongering patients into buying packages of care which you might feel that they need, but we know that they don't need according to the evidence. And I'm sure that a lot of people who sell these generally believe that this patient needs X, Y, or Z £1,000 worth of treatment. But we know that that's not the case. So although they might not feel that they're doing, a lot of these cases, same for both, they might not feel that they're doing a disservice to the patient. They're meeting them where they want to be, whether that's over or undersell in terms of treatment. It is a disservice for me, and that is the unethical two sides of the coin, I guess.
Absolutely. No, it's a really, really good examples there. And I think as well, when you think of that hamstring, it's like when you're seeing someone frequently, what is it you're inferring that you're doing to facilitate recovery? And if it is that, if you weren't under my hands twice a week, then you're not going to, your fibers are going to scar up and not align properly. It's because of the clinical reasoning and the mechanism of effect of which you're deducing, which we would argue is a misreading of the current state of affairs in the evidence, as well as our understanding of human physiology. That again is informing your sales constantly. Sorry to be so repetitive, but it is. I want to just touch on the fact that when people think about sales, I think one of the things that they feel most uncomfortable about is they think that to sell is to be pushy.
Yeah.
Or they feel that then it's not my disposition to do that. And often they're either untaught, or also if you think about the sort of character types and personality traits that might then lead someone, typically we're overrepresented with empaths, aren't we? And rightly so. But then sometimes that means that therefore you're over-empathizing to such an extent that you're feeling like you're intimately involved in understanding their personal finances in such a way that it feels uncomfortable, right? You've kind of gone too far with that, or you've felt that conversation's gone so well that you're then starting to account for more variables than you really should be. And that can sometimes limit you. But one of the things I want to reassure people on is that there's a really important tactic within sales, which is ambivalence. And so done really badly, it's you can be too confident in saying, actually, see how it goes, and therefore it's been such a good intervention that they're going to be knocking on our door next day because it's been so brilliant that us saying see how it goes, they're mortified at the idea of you not having a slot next week. That's probably a bit too cocksure. But generally speaking, done properly, the dial of ambivalence is smart. It's not a perfect example, but we're selling dynamometers at the moment, in part because we've got this Active Force 2 unit. Sorry to drop that in, very cheesy of me, but essentially that is slightly different because it's an obvious product, but it's priced in such a way And it's so accessible. And we really believe in the fact that getting in the most hands is a really good thing for raising standards in MSK, amongst other things. What I'm getting at with this is when I'm speaking to someone, and someone might call, or I'm speaking to people that want a bit more information about it at the moment, my ambivalence is not falsely, but it's kind of turned up to 11, is that I'm genuinely saying, I'm telling them about it, and they're like, that's really interesting. And I honestly am saying, how many do you want? Not do you want one? Because the deal is that good. It's that sensible. We're in such agreement. We've not been in dispute about their utility.
Yeah.
This is someone that's interested. I know the relative price point compared to elsewhere. I know how much value that will bring. I know all the different factors affecting it. And so when I'm genuinely saying, how many do you want? It sounds cheesy, but it's something that applied in a clinical context is that done properly, that's not especially salesy, but it's kind of like, why wouldn't I see you next week? Because you're backing yourself.
I guess the difference in that, you're backing yourself, but you're backing yourself there in a product which is tried, tested, and has, the same results across the board. You use a dynamometer, it's a dynamometer, and that its functions, its ins and outs, they're hard, cold facts. Whereas I guess a lot of the uncertainty around sales is when someone comes in with lumbar-radicular pain, you generally don't know whether they are going to be better in 6 weeks, or they're going to be one of these people that go down the line of having further interventions, injection surgeries. And we know, we know from the evidence, the percentages of that, it is the very small percentages, but you know as well as I do that those cases, for example, are very varying up and down. So I think people will always be on the back foot in not providing overconfidence, and you can be confident without being overconfident, and as you said, being too cocksure. But if you're saying to people, yes, you are going to be better in 6 weeks, or you are going to be better in a fortnight, whatever it might be, that might not be the case. So people are always backpedaling, and you never want to be in a position when someone comes in, and I think it's the fear that everyone has. Someone comes in 6 weeks and says, you said I'd be better by now, and I'm actually worse, or I'm actually still in just as much pain. And I think that's the secret gremlin that sits on everyone's shoulder, that they're going to be called out, or then they extrapolate this in your mind. Oh, I'm going to be taken to court because I told him it was going to be better, and now it's not, and he missed his daughter's wedding, and whatever it might be. And those are the fears that people hold on to, and I think that's what holds people back from being cocksure and being that.
Done well with experience, then you've pitched them plan B and C as well, though, haven't you? You've given them a range of likely possibilities. You've helped them to understand the typical trajectories of something like this. This is one of the things that I think is really, you think about that the bullshit that comes from people going into it a bit too soon. So if someone is fresh out of and doing their own thing without any sort of sense of clinical supervision, remote or otherwise, you can so understand that they're having to guess on a bit of a whim, aren't they? Whereas that's where that experience does help, is that you're kind of able to say, everyone's a unique individual, and the circumstances around their case is always unique. It's something that you're giving your best guess on a circumstance. You're giving them a pitch as to what you've hypothesized to be the trajectory of this. And then, if that doesn't turn a corner, which I'd be disappointed if it didn't, but, we have got these other options available, and we'll definitely be considering that. And often that comes up in the form of people saying, do you think I need a scan? It happens. I mean, how many times a day, Rob, we have that conversation? But it's remiss if you then say, oh, no, you almost turn your nose up at that idea. You then say, well, at this stage, I think that would probably be a bit hasty, but it's absolutely something that can be in our future and might facilitate what we're doing. But the timing is really important for this. So someone's coming with a massively swollen knee. We've not had any moment in which we've even had a chance to do it. It's like, MRI that tomorrow. It was like the MRI equivalent of a car crash in there. I think that'd probably be a bit hasty. Let's just see what's going on here. And so that circumstance and the plan B and C, etc., and the package of which you've managed their expectations is sensible, and that should be a part of what you've sold. I think as well, it's well smart for people to just take a moment to realize that because you're right, the product versus service thing is different, but it's something that being comfortable in saying that what I've just suggested is the best option on the table right now, and I genuinely feel that, genuinely believe it, being honest with yourself, being honest with the patient, is not that dissimilar to how I feel when I say, how many of these dynamometers do you use? Is that fundamentally it's that not because it's super brilliant, because the circumstances around them using that and needing it, they might still be disappointed at that purchase, right? But it's just that I'm being genuine when I say that I think that would be a good idea for you to do that. And that is something that I'm often saying with patients, is that, this I think you'd be wise to act on this advice or for us to collaborate in this way. And if they then opt out of that or for whatever reason, or want to reopen some negotiation as to how that might better suit their needs, that's not a problem. But no. There's no conviction there, but there's still confidence. There's still enough assurance and esteem for me to then say, like, I think this is a bloody good guess, as best I can, from what I've come to evaluate in my professional decision as to what you've paid us for. You paid us for a professional consultation, and this is my evaluation and summary of that. And I think that is something that doesn't need to be cocksure, but similarly, as you mentioned really well, it doesn't need to be sort of too dithery, because that definitely doesn't see things over. And speaks to our last podcast, which is about it doesn't garner compliance with either systems or processes that then help us to get the results we want.
No, exactly. And I think the other phrase which I use a lot to help garner some confidence and stuff is what would you do if it's my family member? And I said, if you were my father, grandmother, son, daughter, this is what I would do. And, rightly or wrongly, and that's for a different question, but, for example, I had a lady who she needed to have a knee replacement, and she was going down that line. And she said, which surgeon should I see? That type of thing. And we were doing some kind of prehab management type thing before she went under the knife. And I said, I go see Surgeon X down the road. That's who I sent my father to, and that straight away is that, okay, I trust him. If that's who he went to, then, and straight away she said, cool, I wouldn't consider anyone else. And that's you can use those types of phrases and help people gain some confidence in your recommendations. If you have generally, I wouldn't lie about it, but if you have generally done something like that, then that works well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that needs to be done judiciously with regards to friends and family, but also, it can be really helpful done well. I mean, one of the things that's interesting with me is that I've got kind of well-documented cases of injury as being a bit of a social commentator in this space. So I've got podcasts in which people know I've had a spinal surgery, for example. And so sometimes I'm even overtly asked that because part of their research and coming to see me has been that. But it's one of the things that sometimes can be helpful, but then sometimes people will over-transpose my story onto that. And that's something that they're then kind of concerned, almost. Yeah. It's like, well, if even you needed surgery, then, it's like, well, let's talk about the differences there. And I think that therefore there are ways in which you can sometimes use your own personal injury or the circumstances, family members of which have been in similar cases. And then also it's also a useful way of sort of personalizing things where appropriate, is that, because you go, I can't remember where it was, but it was a colleague of mine that'd say, like you said, I'd send me, if it were my mum, I'd go and see so-and-so. If it's my mother-in-law, I'd go and see so-and-so. It was like a classic sort of baiting on a joke, as if to suggest.
I like that.
And I said, blimey, you're accidentally slandering that surgeon by suggesting that, and they were saying, oh, don't worry, that's a made-up name. It's like Mr. Smith down the road.
Yeah.
So it was only a bit of a play, but it's kind of, if you think about how those conversations will go and how personal that is that, let's be fair, and it's probably a smart place to wrap up, is that the thing that stops sales being uncomfortable and artificial is it not being. Yeah. And what I mean by that is you just try to find things that are compatible with you, your style, your humor, and to don't then think that you can read sort of business, sales and management books in which it's about used cars and think that applies to professional healthcare services. There are principles of which can be done, but essentially humanize it to you, work out what you're comfortable with, because if you don't do that work, then it's definitely not worthwhile. And no wonder it feels strange, is because it's artificial and not incompatible with your own values.
Yeah, if you've been given a script to read, which, isn't compatible with your own values, but you're trying to remember that verbatim, that's going to come across, and patients are going to understand that, and they're going to see through that in an instant. Patients, I think that's another note to kind of wrap up with, is that patients know when they're being sold something that you don't believe in. They understand that. If you think of the most animated salesman, which you've bought something from, they believed and they trusted in that product. Whereas when you're being sold something which you don't really need or you don't really want, and you're left with a sore taste in your mouth when the patient walks out the door, and no one enjoys that, both the patient or the clinician. So it's something to stay well clear from. Whoever told you it was the best reporter finding script under the sun, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, there's something to be said, especially early doors in your career. You've got to try different types and formats, and sometimes there's phrases you might retrofit, but God forbid when it's a script. I mean, just something that definitely is where those conversations me and you had last time about them being really useful processes and formats. In this instance, it's really not fair if those are too tightly bound with regards to pictures and in sales and stuff. That's where it starts to get false. Don't mistake our prior podcast about the fact that you want to try to have some consistency. With stuff like this, you do want to individualize it, not just to the patient's case as we've gone to death arm today, but also to your own self and values and stuff, and make it as authentic as possible. Because if you're not comfortable, you're not going to come across as comfortable, and no wonder we really struggle with that as an industry at large. Thank you so much as ever for listening. Really appreciate it. This is part of the Physio Matters Network, of course, so do follow at TPM Podcast for all updates there. I'm at Jack A. Chew on Twitter, and that's pretty much my own personal socials. Rob, give them you've got like 10 handles now across all sorts of stuff.
I swear I do. I know too many. Yeah, I've got at Rob Cairo across I think Instagram, which I don't really use, and Twitter, and then at the Back Pain Podcast across all social medias as well. So on both of those, there's too many to remember, really, isn't there?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, we need to. Well, I'm sure we can put that across the show notes, but it'll probably fill the show notes the amount of social media we have to use for this stuff. But, I hope that's been useful. Really appreciate it, and thank you for those that have been feeding back as this show emerges and grows. We're never professing to be experts on this stuff, but we have got quite the lived experience on it and act on it as best we can. And we grapple with these issues both plenty between us off air. And so we wanted to bring some of these conversations to you so that you could maybe learn from them too. If you have anything you want to challenge us on, that's our favorite thing to hear. So please do let us know, positive or negative, and offer feedback. And make sure you do follow this feed, the Physio Matters feed gets boosts some of these episodes, but make sure that you find Therapy Business Matters wherever it is you listen to podcasts, and subscribe, and of course ratings and reviews much appreciated as it's a new show. Thanks a lot, and we'll speak to you soon.
All the best.